Good day, and welcome to the first webinar in the Business Council of Cooperatives and Mutuals Global Leaders Dialogue Series. I am Jim McMillan, Director of Client Services with LBMX, and we are very pleased to support the BCCM with these webinars, which are an opportunity for you to have an up-close and personal conversation with thought leaders in the cooperative and mutual development segment. Our guest today is Peter Hunt, CEO, Mutuo UK. Peter founded Mutuo in 2001 as a first cross-mutual sector body to promote mutual business to opinion formers and decision makers. In 1999, he was a co-founder and secretary of Supporters Direct, the football supporters initiative, which has gone on to establish over 100 supporters trusts with professional football clubs. Peter led the Parliament piloted 4 private member bills to the UK Parliament, working with all parties to update cooperative and mutual law and encouraging employee ownership. Since 2004, he has worked closely on a number of public sector structural reforms, including NHS Foundation trusts, advising both government and trust boards on the adoption of new membership structures. In 2011, he advised the coalition government on its plans to mutualize the Post Office Limited, and in 2012 published the report of the Ownership Commission, a 2-year study into corporate diversity. In 2013, Peter was appointed by Shadow Chancellor Ed Balls to lead a policy review for UK Labour on increasing the role of mutuals in the financial sector and wider economy. The plans to convert Post Office Limited to a mutual is the topic of the webinar today. Peter will present on this topic for about 20 minutes. After that, you will be invited to ask Peter any questions you may have. We will have 15 minutes for questions. You will be invited to type your question to Peter. Peter will try to answer as many questions as possible. If I could now ask Peter to begin his presentation. Peter?
Thank you, Jim, and welcome everybody. I'm going to go straight into the presentation with okay, we're just waiting for the technology to catch me up.
Maybe you could just start going through.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'll start anyway, as the slides try and catch up with me. Here we go. Great. Well, look, I mean, the Royal Mail was seen for many years as an inefficient and loss-making business, and it'd been a bit of a problem for a number of governments with appalling labour relations, very bad relationship between management and the trade unions. So the first attempts to improve the situation involved separating Royal Mail from the state and setting it up as an arm's length corporation. It was still owned by the Department for Business, but it was run as a completely separate corporate entity under the auspices of the shareholder executive. Now, successive governments wanted to privatise the Royal Mail, but it had some structural problems, and the biggest one of these was the reason why the last Labour government didn't continue with this plan, and that was the £9 billion pension deficit, which was held on the books of Royal Mail, which made it virtually impossible to sell. So after the general election of 2010, the coalition government was elected, and they moved rapidly to complete the plans that had been laid by the previous Labour government. And they made a number of significant interventions in order to facilitate the sale of Royal Mail. And I'll just go through those because it's quite important. This is not something that's completely well known, even in the United Kingdom, but it's a pretty important part of the process. It's what made the restructuring of Royal Mail and later Post Office possible. So the first thing they did was to introduce draft legislation into the Houses of Parliament so that it would be possible to privatise the Royal Mail. At the same time, they simultaneously adopted the £9 billion pension deficit and took it on as a liability for the Treasury. The Royal Mail business had for some time been struggling, but management had stabilised it. And to assist the continuation of this, the Royal Mail was separated into two businesses. This is quite important to get. Firstly, the Royal Mail parcels and delivery and logistics service was separated out into a single entity called Royal Mail Limited. And the second part of the business, the post office services, was separated into a second business called Post Office Limited. And so what had always been a single business for several hundred years, really, had now been split into two. This was important because the post office part of the business was still reliant on a government subsidy and was still making losses if you separated it out from the accounts of the entire group. Overnight then, with these actions, Royal Mail became a very profitable and highly sellable individual business. The legislation that was put before Parliament also did a couple of novel things. The first was that the coalition decided that 10% of the shares that would be offered for sale would be reserved to be gifted to employees, making it the single largest employee share scheme in existence. And secondly, the post office would be kept to operate in the public interest, and it would have a new structure operating as a mutual. And I'll talk about how the detail of that has worked out in a minute or two. So if we just pause for a moment and think about this privatisation question. Since I've been preparing to come to Australia, I've been looking at some of the press, I've been looking at some of the speculation around the future of Australia Post. And it's interesting to see that much of the standard argument around privatisation versus public ownership has been repeated here quite recently. So this is a basic argument that government is no good as a business owner. And the suggestion is that by privatising pretty much any business which is owned by government, it is likely to perform better. The competition landscape was also changing in Europe. The European Union had passed directives that made it possible for different national monopolies of postal delivery to be competed with, so that, for example, Deutsche Post could compete directly with Royal Mail and offer services in the UK. And this meant that protected services were suddenly open to broader competition, and this was particularly for the parcels service, quite a challenge to deal with. Just as in Australia, the letters business is reducing and continuing to reduce as email takes over. But in the UK, the parcels business eclipsed that and has more than made up for the losses of letter volumes by increasing the amounts of parcels which are delivered as a result of internet purchases. But the truth is that over the last few years, the Royal Mail business had been run at arm's length from government already. The debate conflates two different things. It conflates ownership and control. Although ownership was indeed retained by the government, the control was separated out, and it was a very much hands-off approach. So by the general election, professional management had succeeded in improving the business. A new chief executive had been recruited from Canada Post, and a well-regarded team was in place. With the pension liability dealt with, many of the previous difficulties had now been resolved. So here you have now two businesses, one which was making profits and one which was still making losses. That was Post Office Limited. And the argument was entered to make the case for selling off the Royal Mail. The argument was that additional capital investment was needed in the changing business to cope with the change from letters to more parcel business. Although publicly we've never really been able to get to the bottom of how much new capital is needed, it was given as a straightforward argument that new capital was required, and the only way to get it was by removing public ownership and allowing external equity investors. And this is a plausible argument at a time, given it was 2010, whether great austerity programs were being introduced, and you could imagine that there would have been a lot of competition for the investment for Royal Mail with other public services. So it is a plausible argument. The case in favour of employee ownership shouldn't be ignored either, because the coalition government has always and consistently supported greater employee ownership, and this is in itself, the single biggest example of them putting their money where their mouth is, where they gift a significant proportion of the ownership to employees. But most of the argument around the changes was conducted from ideological polar opposites, and so you had this situation continuing where people were arguing in favour of public ownership, or they're arguing in favour of privatisation, and very little was discussed about other alternatives. The government help is significant. We need to remember this. The split from Post Office instantly lifted the loss-making burden from the firm, making Royal Mail a much more attractive prospect for sale. Simultaneously, postage stamp prices were increased by more than 30% in a single move. Now, this sounds shocking, but it still left first-class mail prices at some of the cheapest in the European Union. But it went up from 40-odd pence to 62 pence overnight. And actually, I should say that subsequent to the privatisation, there's been another announcement of an additional 5% increase from this April. But you can see that all of these measures, removing the pension burden, separating Post Office from Royal Mail, increasing the revenues of postage prices, significantly improved the Royal Mail revenues ahead of the planned sale. And by 2012, this was a very successful business, turning in profits of over £200 million. And so the government didn't waste any time and moved very quickly to complete the privatisation towards the end of last year. It remained controversial. Trade unions were completely opposed to the sale and threatened national and industrial action. Now, had there been a national strike, it was widely believed by government and by commentators that this would have derailed the privatisation plan. But because of the long process required and the time scale required for a national ballot for industrial action, the government was able to completely outflank the trade unions' arrangements. And so in the time that they were balloting and going through the necessary procedures to get their members' support for a national strike, the government announced the sale and executed the main details of it before a strike could even take place. The public share offer was launched and was completely subscribed. It's very much oversubscribed, and the sale price for individual shares in Royal Mail was 330 pence. So you had a valuation of just over £3.3 billion. Demand was such that immediately the share price went up to £5.50 within a week, igniting a further political row that the share offer had been undervalued. Looking at potentially an undervaluation of about 30%, this is probably more to do with the fear that the government had that strike action would have been completed in time, and they'd chosen a price that they couldn't then retreat from. It's since been revealed that advice that was given to the government last May suggested that the business was probably worth between £4 and £4.5 billion. So even on the advice they had, they knew that they were making a discount, and the share prices continued to rise, with 78% higher than the flotation price. I think this particular argument is going to continue with the opposition sensing it's got some blood there. Let's look at Post Office, because now I've been through the detail of the privatisation, it's important to recognise that what's happened with Post Offices is a completely different plan. And although people do interchangeably use these terms, and often quite wrongly will confuse the two, they shouldn't be mixed up. The Post Office, once separated out, is a £1 billion turnover business. We're talking about the counter services that's offered through the retail operations of Post Office Limited, 9,000 retail outlets operated by independent franchisees, and urban areas having Crown offices with about 4,000 staff of the business directly employed. So there is a lot of similarity with the way that post office services are provided in Australia. The same kind of franchising system with private businesses, and the same kind of threats to the existing service. Same stress from competition from the internet, and the same stress from competition from online banking. Post Office, as I said, is a loss-making business, so it continues with a subsidy from the British government. In the years 2015 to 2018, we're talking about subsidy in the region of £640 million, and that's on top of almost £2 billion of investment that has taken place since 2007. And the money that has been put in to the business is intended to modernise the service, to change much of the capital basis of the business, and to lower its forward-looking costs. The business is now on track to break even and produce profits within the next 2 years. As I said at the beginning, the legislation, when announced that the Royal Mail would be sold, also announced that the Post Office would not be sold, and it would be retained in the business in the public interest. It would be operated as a mutual organisation, but the type of mutual has been left to Post Office to decide. And they have decided that they would have a combination of members representing customers, the communities they served, interest groups, but crucially also the postmasters and mistresses and the staff of the business. Taken together, this makes it the largest single mutualisation of any public sector organisation in the United Kingdom. And the way that it's been handled by the Department for Business is an excellent example of how to create and retain trust, because what they've done is that the Post Office management have decided to involve the stakeholders that they identified, the customers, the multiple operators, the postmasters and the staff, and their representatives of the trade unions in co-designing how this mutual will be operated. And this is a very progressive example of how to build trust in an organisation which suffered from very bad labour relations and very low levels of trust between different stakeholder groups. So each of those groups have been participating in developing this new mutual organisation. So this inclusive process has involved all different stakeholders working together. As I said, the trade unions have played an important role. Having been opposed to any of the changes initially, they have become much more actively involved in helping to design the organisation. And all of these different stakeholders have spent the last 12 months working together to help craft the new Mutual's statement of purpose. And this is really important because they want to establish it as a values-based business. They want this to be understandable and popular with the general public. And they want to use the process, as I said, to build trust and confidence between the different stakeholders who will ultimately have to work together in the new governance arrangements. We, Mutuo, have been involved from the beginning with this whole process by providing advice to the government and then subsequently providing support to Post Office Limited, looking at different structural options to set it up as a mutual and to help to establish and maintain the public service ethos. So I'm just going to run through what may be a number of lessons for those looking at the future of Australia Post. I say this without any particular axe to grind. I'm not suggesting that Australia Post should or should not be privatised. I'm just going to, from the basis of our own experience, pull out some potential lessons that you might want to think about. I've split it into three categories: lessons for the Commonwealth Government, for the trade unions, and also for the public. So for the Commonwealth Government, the first thing I'd say is that it's a bit of a zero-sum game to make the argument that you should automatically privatise anything simply because you think that might make it more efficient. Good management, we can see in the experience of Royal Mail. You can also see in the experience of Australia Post. If it's relatively free from government interference, can and does successfully run public services in the public interest and can deliver dividends to the government and can, around the world, we can see many more examples of this too. Separately, the Post Office example, building on the experience of the broader mutual sector, proves again that you can have a commercial edge. It's a separate business. It has to try to make profits, and it has a commercial edge whilst continuing to achieve its own public accountability. And the first thing I'd say is that that approach, although in the UK example has only been tried for Post Office, that approach could be considered for the whole of the. It could have been considered for the whole of the Royal Mail business without a need for it to be sold separately. So the question now for Australia Post and for the government here is to look at how you can focus on continuing to build on strong commercial skills and a strong commercial ethos whilst maintaining the public service ethos that people are so keen to maintain, and to try to avoid instead turning into a business that's just interested in profit maximisation for its shareholders. I would suggest that you should look at the experience of the Australian mutual sector. There's a number of very successful businesses here, NRMA, Australian Unity, to name two. Talk to these businesses, find out how they can offer their experience of many years of trying to run a successful business whilst maintaining it in the interest of their members. This is the kind of partnership that could work to bring different experience to this debate and would move the argument and the debate away from the pointless dogmatic arguments between public versus private. We can see how from the British example, good management, once freed by direct control, can succeed. It didn't need to be floated. It was already successful before the business was floated. In fact, it's almost a prerequisite of floating a business because people won't buy the shares if it's not going to succeed. So there are different ways of Australia Post being, in the future, a successful commercial mutual. different options could be looked at, from cooperative ownership through to some kind of collective ownership similar to Post Office in the UK. Crucially, the public service ethos through a mutual structure would hardwire this into the management and governance of the business. Having said all of that, if there is a decision to sell it off, I think it's pretty important to learn from our experience and to make sure that the Australian taxpayer is not shortchanged, and to make sure that the full price is paid for the business. But in any case, I think it would make a lot of sense for Australian mutuals and for the federal government to talk at an early stage to help share their experience to shape the future of the business. For trade unions, I'll say two things really. I'll look at the strategy and the tactics that they may adopt. I would start by saying that I think that in as much as the government should be flexible in looking at different options for the future of Australia Post, so should the trade unions, and they should have the vision to argue for a new type of public service business. It doesn't have to be owned by the state. It doesn't have to have political control. And this is a potential way of ensuring that the business cannot in the future be asset stripped and will be maintained in the public good. This kind of mutual approach would, I believe, help to deliver the overall objectives of the trade unions, which is to protect Australia Post for its customers and for its employees. So there's no need to cling to an old ideology in favour of a nationalised business, because there is more chance of that failing as an argument and not providing a new vision for the future. In terms of tactics, well, the British trade unions were soundly defeated by the superior tactics of the British government. And whatever course is chosen, both by the federal government and by the trade unions, I think it's important for all of the participants, and the trade unions in particular, to be smart and ahead of the game. So they should anticipate the steps that are going to be taken by government. I don't think they should underestimate the likelihood that the government will sell the business at some point, or seek to sell the business at some point. And so they should prepare an alternative plan, but don't get caught too late and be unable to make any intervention at all. But the lesson for trade unions is the same, really. A positive middle way between privatisation and public ownership could be for Australia Post in its entirety to be a mutual. And again, the experience and the expertise is there. Work with the Business Council of Cooperatives and Mutuals so that you can see how this can be operated successfully. And for the public, the poor, long-suffering taxpayer, who ultimately are the owners of Australia Post, albeit indirectly through their government, I would suggest that everybody takes a long, hard look at these proposals when they finally emerge, and challenge both the politicians and the trade unions and all of the other people involved in this decision-making process, that they are actually operating in the interests, the long-term interests of Australian taxpayers and consumers. Without direct engagement from the public in this debate, the outcome is genuinely unlikely to serve them well. So, it's an early day opportunity to start to think about how to engage in it and how to try to shape it. Again, you have friends in the Australian mutual sector. I think you should work with them, and you should help to design the future for Australia Post. Okay, so that's the end.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, Peter, for your insights. Peter will now answer questions that are posted to him using your typed dialog box. We have approximately 15 minutes for questions.
Okay, first question is from Anne. The question is, should we privatise systemically important businesses like Australia Post? I'm of the view that there's no single answer to this question. I think that I'm in favour of a diverse range of businesses. I'm in favour of a diverse economy with different types of businesses that are owned in different ways. And I don't think that we should be defaulting to one or the other, whether we should be in favour of privatisation or against privatisation. I think what we should do is have the wit and the patience to look at the whole range of different options, including mutual options, because you need to try to match the type of business structure to the purpose of the organisation. If the purpose is to increase shareholder value, then a privatised business would be appropriate. If the purpose is to raise money for the exchequer, then a sell-off would be one way of doing that. If there's a more long-term approach taken, which is to have a successful business that can pay dividends over a long period, then you might look at a different structure. Next question is from Ramsey Margolis, who asks, to what extent is the success of Post Office dependent on receiving government subsidy? Well, at the moment, it's entirely dependent on receiving government subsidy, and we in the mutual sector have continued to engage with this, partly because we don't want to see a business which is not succeeding or is currently failing to be transferred into a mutual structure. It's currently on track. Its strategy of investment and modernisation is reducing its core costs and is increasing its revenues, and that would, in 2 years' time, deliver it as a profit-making business, which would then be appropriate to be mutualised. But in the meantime, it requires the government support both to buy services from Post Office Limited and also to provide capital investment to the point that they've completed their modernisation process. Okay, Ramsey has asked another question. Sorry, I can't see this question. Next one down. Just bear with me, everybody. I shall. The dialog box isn't opening. Okay, it's open, but we can't see it. Can you move it across? I can't see the whole question. Please.
The question is from Ramsey. Surely it would have been privatized for investors if it was possible.
Yeah.
Possible.
You can't read the full question. I need to move it across. No, I can't.
Surely it would have been privatized for investors if it was possible for it to earn a profit for investors.
Okay, right. So the question is, surely it would have been privatized for investors if it was possible for it to earn a profit for investors. I think, given the starting point from the government, this is likely to be true. But by separating the two businesses out, they made it possible more rapidly for part of the business, the postal delivery service, to be privatized first. Now, having said that, by separating the two out, they've given the opportunity for a much more radical and long-term future for Post Office. And it's also then opened up the potential for the next for this approach to be adopted in new and different areas. So in a way, you know, the fact that it's been separated out has opened people's minds to different potential futures for the such businesses. I've got a question from Alan Gregg. So again, the dialog box isn't opening right across. It needs to be moved across my screen. If you can hear me, people there. I'll try and read it anyway. Alan, from the employee ownership perspective in a privatisation, the most startling aspect of the Royal Mail privatisation was that their 150,000 employees, only some 300 did not participate in the employee share offer. Effort seems to have been placed into educating the workforce about the process and the benefits of it, rather than simply promoting the offer to them from the point of view of capital gain. What can we learn from the UK experience with generating this required leadership to implement similar in Australia with employee ownership and participation? Well, I think what it shows is that the government has actually put its money where its mouth is, first and foremost. It's not just a policy objective to promote employee ownership. The opportunity was there to use some of the assets of Royal Mail to promote employee ownership. And as Alan has pointed out, it was hugely successful, with most employees participating in the plan and understanding it. And this is interesting because it was expected that had the strike ballot proceeded, that the vast majority of members of the trade union would also have voted to strike. So, you know, this apparent sort of double-headed approach was simultaneously being put forward by employees. Now, I think the reality of this is that we are dealing with low-paid staff, and the offer of free shares is significant to them, albeit they're tied up for a number of years before they can be cashed out. It is a significant offer from their employer, and so logic would dictate that they would participate in it. So I guess the lesson for Australia is that it is possible to promote employee ownership by using government stakes, and also it's possible to do this in such a way that it's understood and it is patiently described to the employees. So it's not just about short-term cash gains, but it's also about potentially long-term employee ownership. Now, we don't know if that's going to be the outcome of this, but hopefully it's something that Royal Mail management is looking at right away. Okay. Okay, do we have any more questions?
What are your, here's another question. What are your thoughts on why governments inherently fail at running businesses in the long run?
Why do governments fail at inherently running business in the long run?
Inherently, yeah, they seem to build a good business, and then in the long run, they end up having to, they run deficits continually and then get in this situation.
Well, I don't think that's true, actually. I think that again, we shouldn't conflate the ownership by government and the control by government. It's a long time in the United Kingdom since we had a minister for a Postmaster General who was the minister responsible for making operational decisions about the post office. And so just like Australia Post is a separate corporate entity operated at arm's length, so was Royal Mail. So I don't see any inherent conflict between a government owning a business and a business being run successfully. You could have a look at the examples of a sovereign wealth fund like Temasek in Singapore, which is an active investor in a whole range of different businesses, some of them systemic to the Singaporean economy and others seen as a good investment to make profit to return to the Singapore government. Now, what that shows is that with the right management with the right type of stewardship, this kind of ownership can actually deliver value for the government, both tangibly and intangibly, tangibly in cash terms and in other ways too. But the problem is that it is easily characterized from the basis of the old way of running nationalised services. So in many ways, it suits the argument to talk about governments being no good at running services, when in fact the usual way of providing commercial services that governments own is through arm's length separate corporate entities. Got another question here.
Yeah, can you see it? It's another question.
I can't see it.
How can we move the debate along from the polar one of the public versus private?
This is an opportunity to engage with alternatives. We were able over the last few years in Britain to promote mutual ownership as an alternative for a whole range of different public services. Now, I'm not saying it's appropriate in every case, but there is an opportunity for the Australian mutuals and cooperative sector to work with the government here to look at different potential mutual applications. It could be in a whole range of different public service environments, or it could, let's look at it now, be Australia Post. If you imagine that Australia Post could have a mutual structure, then the future could involve a whole range of different types of mutuals, and the only people who have experience of this and expertise in this is the existing mutual sector. So this is in a sense an opportunity not to be missed by Australian mutuals to show how they run their businesses and educate the politicians so that there is an opportunity for them to see the benefits of mutual ownership. There's another question from Alan. I can't read it. Can someone read that?
Yeah, I think we're going to have it in a second here.
This question is from Alan.
Yeah.
The UK seems to have had a number of long-standing stories of the mutual variety. Greenwich Leisure and Sutherland Home Care Associates, to name two that I know, existed well prior to PSM's policy coming into place. How important were these success stories towards furthering the development of PMS's policy and for bringing the electric along the concept?
Okay, well, the first thing I'd say is I think we need to be truthful that much of what has happened in the United Kingdom around the mutualisation of public services has been a bit of a private debate between the providers of the services and the government. There hasn't been, although a large number of people have joined many of these mutuals, I think they've seen them as joining their particular mutual as opposed to joining some kind of broader mutual movement. But in terms of fostering support for mutualisation, these examples have been absolutely critical in convincing politicians that this is not dangerous, this is something they can work with, and something that actually can deliver better services and better outcomes in a whole range of different public service environments. It is absolutely true to say that there are many examples of public service mutualisations that took place long before the current government promoted employee ownership and have developed over the last few years into quite a significant and solid base of evidence for different types of mutual ownership and different types of mutual applications. So what it shows is that we can have confidence that this process can be adopted and can be tried in different environments. Thanks,
That
Alan.
seems to be all the questions for Peter. This now concludes today's webinar. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, Peter, for your presentation and everyone who has joined the webinar today. Thank you very much.